Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. Hope everyone's having a nice summer season as things in the art world begin to slow down until the fall. In this week's episode, we thought you would enjoy hearing an interesting panel conversation that our founder, Anders Petterson, recently moderated in London. The panel was titled What's Hot and What's Not on the Blockchain, examining the digital revolution of the art world and beyond. The speakers included Claudia Schurch, a specialist at Christie's, Sian Rodway, CEO of MDR and Tech, Bernadine Bröcker Wieder, CEO of Arcual, and Alex Estorick, Editor-in-Chief at Right Click Save. We hope you enjoy the episode on this interesting topic. Thanks so much for listening.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Nina, and again, welcome to everyone here on a Thursday morning. I'm excited to have a wide range of expertise and stakeholders in the blockchain NFT market, and hopefully today we will give a little bit of an update of what's happened. This is a market that is changing fast. Technology is moving. And maybe some of the perception that we've had about NFTs are changing, and hopefully we're going to explore models, what's happening on the creator side, looking a little bit at regulation, looking at various aspects. But I'm delighted to have, as I said, a fantastic panel, and I'm going to start on my immediate left, which is Bernadine Bröcker Wieder. She is the CEO of Arcual, which is the first blockchain ecosystem built by the art community for the art community. And it's a toolkit to seamlessly facilitate the buying and selling of physical art on a permission-based blockchain. And it's founded by the MCH Group, it's the parent company of Art Basel, Luma Foundation, and Boston Consulting Group. On her left is Alex Estorick. He is a media theorist. He's an editor-in-chief at Right Click Save, also a contributing editor to Flash Art magazine, also writing for FT and Freeze magazine. Next is Sian Rodway. He's the COO of MDRX, which is Mishcon de Reo's tech division, and again, a very interesting setup within a law firm. And last but not least, now I'm going to see if I can get the pronunciation right. Claudia Schurch.
Yeah, thank you.
Even my past school German is helping me a little bit. Head of Post-War Contemporary and the 21st Century Art Evening Sale at Christie's in London. And obviously we have a sale coming up Wednesday next week.
28, yes.
That's next Wednesday, is it? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So hopefully we're going to also have, obviously afterwards, there will be an opportunity to see some of these works. So that's what's going to be after the discussion itself. Now, I want to, there's been obviously, I guess the NFT world and the language around NFTs and the market moves always from kind of sort of euphoria to doom, and it seems to be often very little in between. And I think when we look at obviously there's been an adjustment, a correction in many things. There's been a correction in prices. For those of you who are familiar with the Bored Apes Yacht Club, which is these popular series of profile pictures, NFTs that was incredibly valuable and still are to a certain extent. But prices, sort of what we call the floor price, which is the lowest price of a NFT at a certain point. A year ago was about $260,000. Today it's about $80,000. So there has been adjustments. But at the same time, if we look at the actual market itself, 24 billion or 25.1 billion of NFTs was taking place in 2021. So 2021 was the year of NFTs. This is where Christie sold a $69 million Beeple. It was a dramatic and fast-moving market. 2022 was where we're starting to talk about crypto winter. There was talk about collapse. But actually, if you look at the sales value, still 24 billion was sold in NFT sales during the year. So the media, on one hand, as I was saying, I think is reporting on certain parts of the market. As I said, either it's doom or it's sort of euphoria or it's gloom. But actually, there are things happening, and the market is evolving, and technology is evolving, and our perception, I guess, about what NFTs are for is also changing. So I wanted to kind of start. Many of you maybe have different perception of what an NFT is, and maybe how that term NFT has evolved, and maybe what it isn't. And I don't know if I can pass it to Bernadine or start with you.
I can start a little bit, because I do remember when the term NFT didn't exist and art on the blockchain did. So NFT comes from the term non-fungible token, which in essence is using the blockchain not for cryptocurrency but for other metadata. Let's say it that way. So you're not storing information about money, which is fungible. You're storing information about unique items on the blockchain. And so suddenly it got this hype of these three letters, and everyone wanted to buy NFTs, and it turned into a much bigger thing than what it was. But in essence, it's just storing information on a ledger.
Alex, you said this sort of, we talked about before coming on this panel a little bit, this thing of it, NFT and blockchain, that, you know, there was a sort of an aversion to one and an understanding of the other, and in a sense they sort of complicated this relationship. I mean, can you elaborate a little bit on that thing?
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting that, you know, I think the Oxford English Dictionary had NFT as the most popular word in 2021, and yet it still has a huge amount of resistance. And for me, it is strange that there is somehow the blockchain, which is all about transparency and permanence and reliability, is something, you know, certainly the mainstream contemporary art world is digestible for that world. But the NFT, which is obviously all about speculation and corruption, is completely, you know, very still receives a lot of resistance. But the simple reality is that whether you call it NFTs or digital assets or digital objects or artifacts, the simple reality is, you know, we are now, I think, dealing with the reality of a digital art world. Or dare I say, something which blurs the boundary between what was once art and what was once the culture industry, because a lot of the kind of artists that are crypto artists, so to speak, were historically ignored. And we can get on to more discussions about that. But I think it is one of the exciting things for hopefully the folks in this room is this idea that not only are we entering a world of digital objects and a digital art market, but also a digital art market which serves a community of artists historically sort of disregarded. They might have once been digital illustrators. They might have been game engine designers. And I think the one final thing I'll say, because there was a big sale last week at Sotheby's of generative art, which has become, I think, the most, I don't know if it's the most kind of popular area of digital art, but it's certainly the most lucrative, which is art produced using code, art produced using autonomous systems. And of course, Sol LeWitt was producing instructions for someone else to execute a wall drawing in the 60s. Which is effectively an analog work of generative art. But of course, you know, now there's vast communities of digital creators, creative coders, who are producing very beautiful works of generative art, many of which look like kind of modernist painting, which itself is palatable to a particular kind of market. So we're seeing kind of interesting unveiling of previously ignored histories, and I like that because that usually means that more people are able to participate than before the NFT. So NFTs had a bad press, but I think we're kind of coming out of that.
Okay. Moving on, Sian, in terms of the models that we are seeing emerging, I mean, there was, again, maybe the first round of thinking about NFTs was a lot about the speculation around the actual digital asset itself, but obviously there's an underlying technology here that's being used by Arcual that is serving a very different purpose. But from what have you seen in let's say the last 12 months in terms of the trends emerging in how the art world, the broader collectible luxury industry are adopting NFTs and blockchain as a sort of as a tool for their businesses? What are the trends you're seeing there?
Yeah, and I think to pick up on what you said in terms of it being something that is speculative and corrupted, I think that we have to be careful about applying that to the underlying technologies as opposed to the way that it is being used. So certainly there has been a decline in the amount of sort of random JPEG NFTs that are maybe sold at high values and then lose a lot of value and leave consumers sort of unprotected in terms of what assets they own. But I think what we're therefore seeing is brands having to take the utility of NFTs and the value of NFTs a lot more seriously, and think about how they build that into an ecosystem for their users and consumers, rather than as a one-off drop that can sort of plummet in value. So I think that's a good thing, perhaps not for people who bought NFTs in the last couple of years, but now going forward, I think there's an opportunity for brands to use this technology in a really positive way, to engage more users and sort of build their ecosystem as a business, whether that's creating new revenue streams, or actually being able to save costs in some ways in terms of the way that they can generate assets, or enhance their brand. So I think there's really exciting things that big brands now are doing for each of those three areas.
Any examples of any luxury brands who's adopting this strategy at the moment?
Yeah, I think there's a couple. We could talk about Tiffany. I actually really like what Nike have been doing, maybe not falling into a luxury brand, and there's been some news on that this week in terms of some of the collaborations that they're creating. But they've really focused on user experience. And if you go and look at what Nike are doing, they're not talking about NFTs anymore. They're talking about assets that create value for their users, and collaborating most recently with Fortnite to put these assets into a game where they can drive huge amounts of adoption. So I think seeing brands do things like that is really exciting for me.
Bernadine, just in terms from, obviously Arcual is also adopting the underlying technology and NFTs, but from a different perspective. Can you talk maybe just briefly sort of...
Yeah, I think you're completely right. Like a lot of times everything gets put in one bucket, right? And going back to what Alex was saying about there's a movement of artists who were kind of not paid attention to that now have ways to produce creative code, etc. But similarly, there are other ways that artists are using NFTs to document things. And in the case of Arcual, where it's the art market using the NFT technology to document things. But what we've done differently is that we're using the same nuts and bolts without the cryptocurrency consensus algorithms to validate the information. So where other public networks use proof of work in the case of Bitcoin or proof of stake in the case of Ethereum, you can, or Tezos or other public networks, we're using proof of authority, which is more about the reputation of the participants in the network validating that information is true. So I won't go into too much technical information about this, but basically I think it's dangerous to taint the entire thing based on one way in which people have engineered it. One thing that we do know is that it does work at a technological level in making sure that the information is maintained, but that there are also some issues with how it went to market that need to be solved. And those issues can be the fact that people don't understand they have to store their private key, and that they don't understand there isn't a help desk to help you find your information on the blockchain because it's self-custody, it's a concept of self-custody, to the fact that sometimes people don't understand how to interact with these applications with their wallet. So there are lots of usability issues, but the underlying information is stored. And the reason I was mentioning wallets is also the main places of fraud and theft come from people plugging into the wrong place and someone getting their access to their assets, etc. It's not that the underlying information is incorrect. So it's really interesting to look at all of these different things. And when you're early in a new technology, a lot happens. People take advantage. There's all these different things, but you can, through time, even from the moment when we talked about this report back earlier this year and last year to now, you can kind of see what truths maintain some kind of validity over time.
But in your case, I mean, a lot of it, Alex mentioned the sort of evolution of digital art, where it's been there for a long time, but also that digital artist is now finding a space. We're going to come back onto the creator side shortly. But in your case, this is also about the intersection between blockchain and physical art.
Yeah.
So in a sense, this is an infrastructure tool that is linking our existing traditional art world to the blockchain. So what
yeah,
practically...
and we had a similar feeling of we almost don't need to talk about the NFTs and the blockchain anymore, because it's about the underlying functionality of digitizing these agreements and what you can do as a result of moving to an online system. So why has the art market kind of been reluctant to use technology up to now? Sometimes it's also about who are the custodians of this information and where is it being stored, and do I trust that place where that information is being stored? And with blockchain, we actually can create trusted spaces for information, which weren't there before.
So do you think a part of this thing is rephrasing or coming up with a new language for that NFTs, in the sense, I mean, Alex already mentioned it, it's slightly actually...
yes, absolutely, and
it provides noise, which actually kind of distracts us from what it actually can do.
Absolutely. So Arcual's, we have a feature that's called a digital dossier, which actually is a lot of NFTs and smart contracts bundled together that are transferred to the person who purchases the work immediately when you pay through the system. But a digital dossier somehow resonates more with people. They understand, okay, normally when I purchase an artwork, I receive a dossier. And that is those are my pieces of paper about the artwork. And in this case, I'm getting a digital dossier. It just is interesting how wording can impact how people look at it.
Perfect. Now let's move on to the creators. And Claudia, I wanted to talk a little bit about from your experience within Christie's to see, obviously we have seen over the last 18 months to 24 months, the evolution of the digital, the creativity aspect of things. But how has that changed from your perspective, what you see within the auction houses, the way you curate sales? We're going to come a little bit back to the kind of model of Christie's 3.0, etc. But just purely from an artistic point of view, how has this evolved from Beeple in March 2021? Is the interest still there? Is what type of artist are you now?
Yes, of course. I mean, I wanted to follow up on what Alex was saying on how artists that perhaps had been forgotten or had been overseen suddenly have a spotlight. And I think when you think about the history of art is always revising itself. We're always expanding it, not only for digital art, but for, like every single category. There's always a discovered artist. There's always someone that where we want to include. So for me personally, I think the way we see digital art, artists have always trying to push the barrier with what they're working on, be it an installation, be it a performance, be it digital art. So it's basically, we humans tend to work with what we have. And the more technology develops and the more immersed we are in it, it's only obvious that people started, thinking about it differently and experimenting. The sale of Beeple was obviously a huge eye-opener in the sense of, I don't know if anyone expected that kind of result. And suddenly seeing that kind of result and seeing the amount of wealth, the amount of interest there was, it kind of like opened this door where there, as you say, there was this sense of frenzy, right, that is kind of stabilizing, which I think is a good thing. So yes, definitely. I think we take it extremely seriously. Like we look at artists no different way as we would look at more traditional artists. We think about their practice. We think about where are their careers going. We think about it big picture. We don't compartmentalize it as in, okay, this is digital and this is everything else.
But and sort of in that choice of when you put together either a dedicated, digital sale, NFT sale versus including maybe these objects, so these digital objects in mainstream sales, but your choice of artists, what is that driven by? Is it driven by a collective demand that you see, or is it driven by an opportunity to maybe give a platform to artists that has had a long career in this field, but never doesn't necessarily have the visibility? What is it?
I would say it's both. Look, there's a team that is fully dedicated to that, to kind of really choosing and like putting auctions together that are fully NFT. Those we put on a new platform we created since September called Web 3.0. And there, I was actually talking yesterday to the team, and they really see it as an incubator. This is a space where you will see the most cutting edge, the most interesting artists. They're like really working differently, not digitally, within the blockchain. Like they're really kind of like pushing the boundaries. But like the market perhaps is untested at the moment. It's like where you begin, basically. What they're looking at is, like that the artist has a track record, as in he's been working. He hasn't just made one work, right? Like what happens if you sell that and then he leaves? So they think about all those things. Then when the artist kind of develops a little bit more and has a bit of more of a track record, when the prices go up, like Web 3.0, you would look at works between $5,000 to $100,000. Once you cross that barrier, we start thinking about, okay, so this artist, where should we place it within all the other auctions that we have at Christie's? So for example, who I'm heading the evening sale in London. Last season, we had an NFT by Tyler Hobbs. He's a very established artist. He has had exhibitions with very established galleries. He has a track record that has been tested.
Alex, interesting you mentioned generative art and
Tyler Hobbs is a generative artist.
So tell us a little bit about, for those maybe, what is it, and why do you think this has become the kind of phenomenon within the digital arena that actually starting to gain this kind of traction? Start with the definition maybe.
So the generative art goes back to Max Benzer in the 1950s, and there are a lot of artists, actually a number of whom in their mid to late 90s still alive, people like Frida Nacker, Manfred Moore, Vera Molnar, Michael Knoll, who worked at Bell Labs in the US. And so since the sort of early 60s, actually coinciding with conceptual art and Sol LeWitt, so it's funny, like artists and technologists were always working side by side, but the markets for their production were demarcated in a way that the NFT has kind of removed that separation. So now it makes sense that an artist like Tyler Hobbs, who essentially is producing variations on what they were doing in the 60s, can succeed. And we are seeing this, my magazine is recording this whole kind of golden generation of generative artists who now have a means of marketizing their work. And the NFT kind of unlock this sort of, I think, kind of burgeoning potential for the generative art market. The other thing that I think is interesting, and Tyler Hobbs I think one of the reasons he's become particularly popular is that when his work he regards the printed image as still the highest resolution output of his work. You can look at it on your phone, you can look at it on a screen. In a sense, art after the NFT is a kind of liquid enterprise rather than being static and portable in the way that a painting is portable. But we're still at a stage, it seems, where the print is still the highest resolution form of digital object, which is really interesting, not least because, sorry, this isn't like I'm going to reference Philips. Philips had had a sale last summer of generative art, and Tyler Hobbs was sort of printed out big. And what was interesting about that was just the fact that this sort of what we call a sort of born digital object, an object which had been produced in a natively digital state rather than on a canvas. When it was printed, it had the effect of, I think, basically renewing painting in a funny way, because the marks that were being printed were not really conceivable, or I hadn't seen those marks being made by painters. And of course, the obvious comparisons one might make is back to sort of post-painterly abstraction, something like that. So there's a kind of, it's a kind of curiosity in a way, because there's a sort of time lapse. It's almost like the sort of last 50 years of sort of postmodern art has kind of collapsed back in time, partly because, in a sense, there was no way of making a market for this kind of work. And so that's very exciting. And I think, it's clearly very important for the art world in general to have a way of onboarding into the digital art market. And it seems to me that generative art has become that kind of gateway drug, so to speak, which is obviously a great thing.
It leaves us a little bit with, you mentioned how NFTs in a sense has been unlocking and act as a catalyst for these artists to reach the market. On the other side, I guess the NFT technology has opened up from a collector's side to people who couldn't access or had difficulties access art. And art in general, and particularly obviously digital art, because it was, what do I own? How do I maintain it? What I do when the technology moves on, etc. And I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the audiences. And maybe I go back to Claudia a little bit again, thinking about Christie's and the kind of, the people that are buying now NFTs or digital art, are they from your traditional pool of collectors and clients, or are they new? If you think about Beeple, for example, and I assume these were a significant amount of new people that are coming into the market, and how that sort of sits within the Christie strategy in terms of thinking about new audiences, next generation, etc. And who are the kind of typical, without mentioning names, but...
I mean, I think to answer your question, it's both. In the end, the way we look at things and the way we buy, we don't buy, in a single category. It doesn't fight that I love contemporary and I also like old masters. It doesn't fight that I love digital art and I like impressionism. We as human beings, we consume images and art in a very open way. And I think... And I think we see that very clearly, like when people that were interested in that Tyler Hobbs that we had in the evening sale were both people that collect digital art solely, but we also had very traditional clients looking at it. We sold 12 works by people privately, and they all went to very traditional or collectors that collect in a traditional sense. However, having said that, Web 3.0, it does attract kind of a younger client, a very tech-savvy client, because of course, it has the wallet, it's like full on the chain, and it does attract a lot of new clients to Christie's that perhaps, wouldn't have come through the traditional way. So I think it's both, and I think there's a big crossover between them. The fact that you enter as a digital collector, we know that then they've been moving into other categories. So it's super interesting.
Sian, in terms of maybe looking at other collectors, do you have a sense from the projects you're working on, the clients you're working on, in who are the audiences? And again, I'm thinking this whole thing intersection between the traditional versus the new. It seems that the technology has an amazing ability to build communities and very energetic and very passionate and very... which obviously from a brand point of view, you mentioned Nike and, starting to think about tapping into gaming communities where Fortnite players can have their players wearing Nike shoes, I assume, or all those things are with a value that can then potentially be sold. And there's these sort of, again, coming back to the audience, what do you think, the brands are doing? Is this tapping into something new, or is it to kind of maintain the existing, giving them something, or maybe both?
It's a really good question. I think that we have seen, certainly with our clients, we talk about sort of Web3 natives, and they do tend to have a certain demographic, usually younger people, potentially with interest in gaming, very tech-savvy, in the way that they have grown up and consume media. But I do think that that's something that in order to see adoption of this space, brands have to unlock. And going back to the earlier point, I think the way that they are doing that is by not making the way that we collect and own digital assets something that is within a black box and hard to understand and described using the technology as opposed to the user experience. So I think that is certainly starting to change over time. I think it raises a really important question for the role of intermediaries, actually. What role do intermediaries have in helping a wider customer base in adopting these technologies? Because really they will succeed if we can crack adoption. It can't just be the Web3 native crypto bro that uses these technologies. If we do see Web3 as something that is going to be, underpinning the future of the internet.
How far away do you think we are from kind of a seamless integration between the traditional and how far is technology? It's moving at such a fast speed, but how do we how far are we away from where? At the moment, it's still kind of clunky because you still need to have a wallet. You need to, for those of you not familiar, you suddenly have to remember tons of different words, and if you lose them, which you probably written down on a piece of paper, you get it lost, and you lost everything. I mean, it's sort of, how do we come to a point where it's almost like we are so used to having an Apple phone where you just click and your fingerprint and boom, we're in, and we don't need to remember anything anymore. Are we getting closer to that stage?
So my answer to that has actually changed recently with developments in generative AI, for instance. The speed at which we can now develop these technologies has massively increased, which means building ecosystems that allow the average user to engage with these technologies. I think that we're now going to see that happen more quickly, coupled with the fact that brands have latched onto the market is not big enough if they only focus on Web3 natives. They need to create experiences for a bigger user base.
Can I pick up on something? We did a text on digital fashion recently, and I just want to make the point that although the NFT had its moment in 2021, last year was a big year for blockchain poetry, which has its own market now. People can sell poetry on the blockchain in a way they couldn't previously. This year, I think, is definitely the year for digital fashion. And I know that a lot of luxury brands, when you think that 75% of US children between the age of 9 and 12 have a Fortnite or a Roblox account, and they can buy skins from Balenciaga and Chanel and so on. What these luxury brands are doing is they are sort of putting a down payment on the kind of mind space of these potential future buyers who might not have kind of money at the moment, but they have the potential market share in the future based on this sort of preemptive investment. I think a lot of luxury brands, particularly in the fashion industry, which has I think taken on this interest in phygital fashion, sort of kind of trying to play with ideas across physical and digital. Maybe you sell both at once. Maybe you use the digital as a way of getting physical customers. So I think I think the luxury fashion industry in particular is the industry which is playing probably most effectively with that. So
I was just going to build on that. So we've just finished writing the Web3 and Metaverse strategy for Selfridges, and they have certainly bought into that in that they are trying to use these technologies to encourage people to engage with the brand and invest in future buyers of the Selfridges brand. I would say that we have to be careful about combining phygital or the metaverse with Web3 technologies. They are separate technologies so phygital, we're often talking about the metaverse and combining physical and digital experiences, which you can do without using blockchain, NFTs, Web3 technologies. Often, like with the example you used on skins, it can be enhanced. You can enhance a metaverse or phygital experience with Web3, but it is important, I think, for us to make sure that we're using those terms separately.
Well, also AI is also has been developing for many decades on its own track, Web 1, 2, or 3, and I think that's interesting in the sense that you have these sort of not competing paradigms, but sort of interlocking digital interests and technologies, and so blockchain, NFTs, smart contracts are now, I think, in practice, going to be working together with generative AI. And it happens to me, like, I had a look at the market, and the market for digital art produced by generative AI, I think, is currently higher than the market produced by generative art, which is the difference between people using a prompt to produce an image and people writing code painstakingly to produce images. So it just goes to show that, if not in the technologies, then in the marketplace, these kind of these worlds are kind of overlapping. And I suspect AI might be the one that drives the direction of Web3. I'm not sure.
I'd like to touch on that point because I think Web3 has gotten conflated with cryptocurrency quite a lot. But I don't think that's necessarily what it's about. It's kind of about a different way of thinking about ownership of your information online. So yes, the cryptocurrency infrastructure was used for that because you had your wallet with your cryptocurrency without needing an intermediary of banking to be able to interact with it. So you had this kind of disintermediation, for want of a better word. But I think philosophically what Web3 was about, where Web2 created these giants of Facebook, Google, YouTube, where you conflated everything, and they also, in order to be able to work, also owned your data to a certain extent. Web3 is philosophically about taking ownership of your data back into your wallet, whether that is your money or your things from your Roblox account.
Yes.
And having that transferability and portability of your items. So it relates to metaverse because it relates to how you interact with these 3D environments and how you interact with your digital self. But it also relates to cryptocurrency because you store that in your wallet. Was that kind of what you meant? And I'm just trying to unpack what you were saying about the difference between phygital and Web3.
Yeah, certainly. So I would agree with that. I think that Web3 is about ownership. It's about being and consensus and decentralization often, although, like I said, that leaves an interesting question for organizations that act as intermediaries. But that is different to creating a digital avatar of myself, which I don't necessarily need to own. So that could be something that is useful to own in some contexts, but also something that I'm quite happy to, create on Ready Player Me, and that digital asset exists in a virtual world in a way that doesn't need to, it doesn't have value. So I don't need necessarily to own that.
I agree. And one of the things that was so strange about the NFT boom was where value was attributed to these digital things that were almost like throwaway digital things.
Yes.
That you then suddenly had people putting value to them just because they were stored on a blockchain.
Yeah.
And I think we'll move more towards putting things on a blockchain that you want to store and that have value.
Exactly.
Rather than putting things onto a blockchain because you want them to have value.
Yeah. It's interesting how many clients we actually turn away saying, no, this isn't a Web3 project. You can do this with Web2 technologies.
Excellent. I just very quickly, you mentioned intermediaries, and I think, well, I guess we're sitting in a place of intermediaries.
Thank you. They're very important.
Many of you are representing intermediaries, and I just wanted to sort of, in the role of decentralization, what role do these intermediaries going to have? I mean, they're still cutting out the middlemen, and particularly in the marketplace where the middlemen, in a sense, are the tastemakers. They are the one that creates value. Simply just take them out doesn't really create anything. So how do we, as intermediaries, and this is an open question, whoever wants to answer, what is the role of intermediaries in a Web3 type of environment? Alex, I don't know if you want to. You look like you're sort of.
So it's kind of contested, I would say. Like the kind of the utopian in me wants to say that what kind of blockchain NFTs and Web3 as a whole allows is for an artist to sell directly to their collector, and that's sort of what happened in the early days of NFTs, and there are a lot of great examples of successful crypto artists who didn't rely on Christie's to make a name for themselves, or traditional commercial galleries. The thing about being an outsider digital artist is that not all, but a lot of these artists want to also be inside. And I think that it means that I think Christie's and Sotheby's in particular have been very savvy about acknowledging that, and I think there is a competition going on between, as it were, the art world cherry picking which artists it wants to include, and I think something more profound, honestly, happening. I mean, you guys were talking about avatars, and one of the fascinating things about the NFT, and particularly Bored Ape Yacht Club, I'm going to go with CryptoPunks. CryptoPunks is a 10,000 avatars produced using one algorithm. So it is an example of generative art, although it's never described as an example of generative art. And that's interesting because it's also described as a collectible. So it is simultaneously a collectible and, as it were, art. Now that kind of problem is a new problem, I think, for something like the art world. So I think that there are sort of different discussions you can have. I think there's one in which traditional mediators can, in a sense, dictate the terms of the future art market. And I think there's a sort of reality that what is happening is definitely an expansion of the bounds of what is creative production. I would say, and this is kind of my personal shtick, that, and there's a very good writer called Max Haven who wrote a book called Art After Money, Money After Art. He doesn't use the word art, he uses the phrase art money. And the thing about the NFT is it brings together art and money transparently for the first time. And these two, of course, have been linked together since, I don't know, however long you want to go back. But that, I think that acceptance that we're dealing with a financialized object changes how we talk and the language we use to talk about this stuff. But of course, being in this environment, it's very hard in a sense to break out of that envelope. But I think that is sort of, that's what I'm hearing from the artists themselves, and I think that's a good place to start. Okay,
bringing me on to my kind of towards the final.
Can we still comment on intermediaries? Because I think that was
you
a
answered
really
the question.
No. Yeah. I think you started on a really good point about this was about making it direct, right? About the artist and the collector directly. But we saw artists burn out from marketing their own works. We saw people getting scammed. We saw misinformation on the blockchain, etc. So I see the role of intermediaries of bringing value to that market, right? Like they are ensuring that the information is correct. They are protecting the consumer. They are doing the legal checks to make sure that that's correct. Yeah. Just bringing actual value rather than just being the door.
Claudia?
Yes, I wanted to add 2 points. We say about, you mentioned the word cherry picking, but it's no different from contemporary art. It's like upstairs I have an artist that's going to be for the first time at auction. How does she land at Christie's in an evening sale? There's a lot of criteria that goes into it. A lot of thought. We look at the art. We look at her career so far. We look at representation. We look at demand. We look at like market dynamics outside of the secondary market. And I think that's exactly like our role as intermediaries, like kind of like making sure that the right, that we're offering the right works to our clients. Web 3.0, it's a lot about giving our clients transparency. You can connect your wallet, immediately. The KYC is all covered by us. That, the backgrounds of bidders and sellers is being checked. Every bid is an open transaction. You know who and at what level is bidding. So I think in the end, that's our role, like facilitating and making it more accessible and easier to navigate for clients.
And the only thing I would add to both of those points is about the experience. Buying through Christie's is an experience, as opposed to buying directly with an artist, where you might not only get all of the points around safety and security and transparency, but also I think that Christie's can create an experience. You can come here, you can experience the art, you can talk to people about it in a way that you can't if you are buying directly from an artist, perhaps.
That brings me nicely to the end. Thinking about intermediaries as a place that can, entities that can create trust. Trust has been broken and has been corrupted in many ways over the last 18 months, but actually intermediaries act as that sort of safeguard. And now, the other, obviously, way of thinking about safeguarding is the way the regulators and the government and everyone thinking about this space. We're starting to see sort of an increasing financialization of the market, whether it's collateralizing NFTs through the things like Blend, you have fractionalization, all of those things where regulators in different countries are looking at this space and saying, is it an asset class, or is it something else? Where are we? I don't know who wants to pick that up, Bernadine or Sian. Where are we in this? Where are we right now? It seems the regulator, obviously, in a very fast-moving space, they always have to do the catch-up. But where do you think kind of leads us between the balance between self-regulation, where these entities, these intermediaries act as the guardians of trust, versus someone else stepping in from the outside, authorities clamping down? Where do you think it's going to head? whoever wants to.
Well, one thing that's in the report that I was saying that some things rang true. I think that regulation can quickly also become outdated because the space is moving so quickly. So a lot of the countries who first regulated cryptocurrency are now having to update their regulations for crypto assets and digital assets and utility tokens versus the ones representing money. So I think that it's going to be a fast-moving space. But in terms of, for example, our project and why I think Arcual has come about, it's also about self-regulation and about making sure that you protect the consumers and you do the checks and balances to make sure that the market continues to be trusted and also uphold certain level of ethics, like protecting the artist, like championing the creator royalties or anything else that might be there. So I think there's an element of governments will step in. They need to. They're going to keep updating the regulations, but also we as an industry are going to keep updating as well and thinking about how we can be better.
Yeah.
Can I just pick... Sorry. August 2022, the EU advisor on this, Peter Kirstens, confirmed that NFT collections will receive the same treatment as cryptocurrencies, which would mean that exchanges who trade in NFTs would be subject to the same stringent identity checks and transaction reporting requirements as other obligated entities such as banks. So my sense is at the moment there's an attempt to align crypto with NFTs. A lot of people won't like that because there are lots of different kinds of NFT asset. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, I think it builds on that. I certainly see regulation as something that can really stimulate this space, actually, because it increases trust and the sense of consumer protection, but we have to keep it moving fast. And I have to say, in the UK, I do think we're doing a really good job of that. The work of the Law Commission and Sarah Green and building on that, really making recommendations around how crypto assets need a third class of property right, sort of progressing that conversation really rapidly is only positive for this space, in my opinion. I think we can also potentially see where regulators maybe don't drive innovation. If you look at the recent Binance and SEC example, I am sure that there were things in Binance that could have been done differently. But the move to sort of immediate action and sort of a very... there wasn't a relationship between them to improve clarity on the regulation. It went straight to enforcement. And I think that regulators do need to be careful of doing that because of the impact that has on innovation.
Perfect. Okay, so before we open up for the questions for the floor, I'm just going to have, as this title of the panel is What's Hot, What's Not on the Blockchain, this is an opportunity to... I'm not sure if you want to focus on the not bit, but well, we'll see. But start with Claudia. I mean, just quickly, there's something, what's happening in the very near future that you might sort of want to
Well, in the very near future, we have an auction on the 20th of June. Please come, have a look upstairs. I think one of the most exciting lots we're going to be offering is, as I mentioned, Sahara Long, first time at auction. She's a young British artist. She did her residency at Palazzo Monti, which is an amazing residency in Italy that was hosted by Katie Hessel. She is represented by Tim Taylor, currently has her solo show, so go across the street and see her. So it's a very beautiful self-portrait that we'll be selling. So very excited about that.
Sure.
Okay, so I'll start with what's not, and I think we've backed it up in this conversation, terminology here. Let's stop talking about the technical terminology and start talking about utility and user experience. For me, in terms of what's hot, I'm really enjoying following artists like Andrea Bonacito, who's combining AI and NFTs in order to create, I think, something different in the market, and we're kicking off some work with George Fox in that sort of space as well, so really excited about those two.
Alex?
I think I've said too much anyway. I mean, I think it's maybe interesting for folks to look at perhaps digital asset classes which they haven't previously considered. I think blockchain poetry is potentially an area which has massive growth. One of the interesting things there is, although it's great that poetry and a single poem can sell to a single collector. What's interesting about that is that poetry is often tied to an image because an image is kind of a way of an inducement to reading now. And all the poems tend to be quite succinct, so we're seeing kind of interesting cultural development in poetry. I think personally, digital fashion is very interesting because it's not obviously playing by the same rules as the traditional fashion industry. And I would say that both with poetry, crypto art, and fashion, a lot of the reason new digital designers or creators are getting into this is that they don't have to rely on the kind of Illuminati who previously presided over these different industries. So, yeah, I think what's interesting about digital fashion is it actually exists in a curious halfway house between fashion and digital art. So it's a kind of, I'd ask people to be open to these new kind of markets, because a lot of, at the early stage, those markets will be invariably highly affordable.
Interesting. Bernadine.
That was a lot to think about. And I agree about blockchain poetry. The verse is amazing. So in terms of what's not hot in blockchain, in my mind, is a lack of clarity on what the artist wants. So some people bought a work and didn't know, is it an NFT? Is it just the digital image? Is it a digital image that I can print off? Is it something that I can use as my Twitter image? Or does the artist want me to maintain it in a certain way? I think that's the bit that frustrates me. I've collected generative art, and I have a conversation with some of those generative artists, and they'll say, I'll never want my work to be seen in this way in the metaverse. Where's that information? We don't have it. We don't know what they actually want us to do with these things. And so the experience of seeing art on NFT marketplaces for me is not how art should be seen. And so that's what I'm done with, like the trading of little postcards, little squares. So what is hot in my mind is going back to what the artist actually intended and being able to store that on the blockchain of what they actually want the work to be, how they see it within their oeuvre, what the licensing terms are, etc. I was on a panel discussion at Art Basel just on Saturday where we were talking about this idea of having licensing tied to the token. So when you are transferring the ownership of that object, you also transfer the legal rights that are attached to that object, so you then know what you're buying. And I think that that's where we're going, is more clarity on what are you buying and what does the artist want it to be.
Fantastic. I think we'll leave with some questions. We've got time, Nina? Yeah. Questions from the audience. Anyone who has a burning... Yes.
Hi, and thank you, everyone. It was really fascinating. Bernadine, it's a question for you, really. I know you mentioned there was no help desk as such, and of course regulators are working hard to make this kind of tricky terrain a little bit easier to traverse, but I wondered if there was anything emerging that would help new collectors to find their way around the blockchain, and whether there are kind of bodies or assemblies that you see emerging to kind of give back a little bit and help new collectors.
That's a great question. I think there are two initiatives. So there's kind of more the grassroots initiative where collectors are helping each other to understand what's going on, and artists are also helping collectors understand how to take care of their wallets, having cold storage for their NFT assets, etc. But I think there's also a new intermediary coming in, whether that is wallet providers, and some of the crypto exchanges are professionalizing themselves to be able to offer these services. But I think at the end of the day, it's about trust. Who do you trust to be a custodian of this information? And there is a gap there, a definite gap, and I think it has to do with larger trusted entities understanding the space, but also hardware limitations in terms of what you can do on your phone and how that interacts with these ledgers. But there is a huge opportunity there.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yeah.
Hi. I wonder if the panel have any thoughts on fractional ownership, not so much from the perspective of an investment vehicle, but from other applications of fractional ownership from the perspective of access and opportunity.
Anyone?
Hasn't been successful so far.
But I guess the question is, what is fractional ownership, right? Because some generative art pieces, artists think of them as one whole piece, and then you have the 10,000 CryptoPunks. Is that one work, or is it?
I assume that's not what you were referring to, but I mean,
yeah,
yeah. Yeah, I don't think that's what you're referring to. But I mean, you can have these vast sets of, like you could have like 200 prints of a Dura print, for example. In a sense, that's what you're buying with like, whether you're buying a CryptoPunk, you're buying, the one difference being that it's a fundamentally unique object which looks different. But then so would a kind of one state of a Rembrandt over another state. So I think there's a question about the serial object. But as far as I know, fractional ownership of digital objects, digital works of art, has not taken off in a way which is slightly surprising. It may have more success with physical artifacts. I don't know.
But then with physical artifacts, can you actually divide it from an investment if you're only buying a part of a painting that is in storage? Don't know. It's a question.
Sian, do you want to have any?
Yeah, no, I think I agree. I do see there are plenty of opportunities here, and I think when we talked earlier about accessibility, maybe this is a good use case for greater accessibility, but I think it comes with the challenges that we've just talked about around whether you feel the same value or can create that same value through fractionalized ownership. So I think that's probably some of the blockers to it taking off.
I'm just wondering, again, when you're thinking about fractional ownership of NFTs, for example, like a Bored Ape, I mean, from an ownership point of view, whether you own a fraction or whether you own the actual original, I guess the original owner can use this as a way of, potentially as a fundraising capital tool to free up some capital to be used for other purposes. I mean, you're starting to see a little bit in the this financialization aspect, which is also happening in the lending side, where you can pledge these NFTs and then raise money to use for other purposes. This is something we see in the physical world as well as in the NFT world. Alex, do you think there's a particular reason why you haven't seen the kind of, do you see things evolving so quickly in the NFT world? Why the fractionalization hasn't maybe taken off? With regards to digital assets?
I'm just thinking more about what Bernadine said. I think one of the things I've noticed is that we did an interview actually with Tyler Hobbs, who did a project called QQL last summer. And the interesting thing about QQL was it gave the collector much more power over the ultimate thing that they bought. So Tyler Hobbs would gift you the algorithm, so to speak. You would play with the parameters of the algorithm, and you would become yourself what he termed a parametric artist. So I'm not sure, I can't speak for fractional ownership, it's not really my world, but shall we say, the subdivision of creativity or co-creation has become a big kind of thing in Web3, a way of inducing collectors to participate more actively in the production of a work. That has created some debate over the difference between, for example, generative art and parametric art, which is to say, some people believe that parametric art, which follows the example of, for example, something like Zaha Hadid, which has used parametric design to produce buildings for many years, with generative art. And I think there are people who believe that parametric art is a subdivision of generative art. And there are people like Eric Calderon Snowfro, who created the squiggle, which is one of the purest examples of generative art, who regards parametric art as fundamentally separate. Yeah, it's just another area where I think the old sort of parameters are breaking down.
Question at the back.
I'm a bit of a biased, person on this one because I own a fractional ownership website in the UK. So if you look from a success point of view, we have a competitor in the United States called Masterworks, which I'm sure everybody knows about it. I don't agree with a lot of the things that they do, but they have $900 million assets under management, and they have been successfully buying and exiting paintings. Although they go to mass retail clients, which selling a soulage to a taxi driver maybe is not the right way to do it. There is definitely a demand, for that, category. Also, the thing is that if you have the right art, it's very difficult for a lot of people to access that art. So if it's really iconic, not many people can buy a $5 million, $10 million painting. Even if you have 100 million, you wouldn't want to put 5%, 10% into one painting. So it actually provides an incredible access that you couldn't otherwise access. So from that point of view, I think there are a lot of stuff in the detail, but it, I think, works. So
yeah, I think probably where it's It's conceptually possible, but I think where you were saying it's not really working is like it's not had the traction that you would have with other NFT projects where it's just, and my personal opinion is that there's an issue with understanding what you're owning when you have that fraction of it. Because in my past job, I was working with museums, and a lot of my work was telling museums not to do NFT projects unless they understood what they were selling. Because I think that often, if you sell a JPEG of a work that's in the museum collection, people are going to draw a conclusion of what that actually represents and whether that is a fraction of that work. And I think that, again, it goes back to why is it not working? Because we're not defining already from the beginning, what is it? What are we actually investing in?
You're absolutely right. If it's an NFT asset, it's a very... What's the value of having something?
But are you really owning the physical asset, or are you owning the SEC registered, a share in the SEC registered company that owns the physical asset?
I mean, it's a securitized asset. House, but still the value is there. There's, I think, a group. And I think the issue really comes to regulation. How much, I think that for just a couple of things. One, for collectors, it's a very trusted way of building. For artists, they can keep their shares.
I guess the other thing with fractional ownership is we mentioned things like with NFTs or with blockchain, the whole aspect of utility. I mean, I guess part of the generation of fractional ownership has been very much linked to the investment returns. But I mean, if you can start to link in other things, that is giving you access, giving you privileges, giving you educational or whatever. I mean, playing a little bit on what you say in the fashion world, which seems to be, digital fashion it's an entry point to kind of provide them potentially with something that has a financial value, but also that gives them access to whether it's gaming or other things. I mean, I think there might be an evolution of that model that starts, because if you think about any emotional asset like art, if you purely focusing on the financial, you are cutting out probably the biggest reason why people are involved in this space in the first place, which is the emotional and the passion aspect. So if we can bring that, I guess, back into the equation somehow, then we have both. Then we are back to what the traditional world, like if you buy something at Christie's, you have both the financial value and hopefully the pleasure of owning the object itself. Any further questions? There's a question at the back.
This is probably a very stupid and naive question.
There are no stupid questions.
I'm sure it's going to make me sound really, really old. I'd suggest that people engage with artworks on an emotional level. Love them. That's why they buy them. Do you think it's possible artworks? Like, where's the enjoyment? Where's the emotion?
I bought digital art because of the emotional attachment I got to seeing it, actually, in my private capacity.
But where do you see it? On your computer?
There's technology has developed, and now there's these almost screens that you can install in your house, and it almost, when you look at it, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't own one, but it almost looks like you have a painting hanging, right?
You can. It can be that you want to display it. It can be that you want to support that artist, and you think what they're producing is so fantastic, and it really moves you that you think, I want to buy a piece because I want them to keep making stuff.
But then you also want to.
You also want to look at it. Yeah, I don't know. It's really interesting. So this is me talking in my personal capacity, but there's a very different thing about buying a digital work that everyone can see. There's less of that showing off that I've got it on a wall or something like that. Sometimes there is, but it can also just be the fact that you supported that artist, you have it in your wallet, you can put it in a metaverse gallery or whatever it is and legitimately have it. But I think that's going back to the hardware issue and some of the issues with the user experience. The emotional attachment I had in that specific purchase was supporting that artist.
Right.
Yeah.
It's just not something that people really talk about. They talk about NFTs and blockchain, and it sounds very safe and guaranteed and tight and all that stuff. It sounds great, but it's just where's the type?
There's a couple of things, and clearly something profound has changed. I would say that on the one hand, the meaning, probably you now have greater access to the artist who sold you the work, presumably. because in principle, this sort of digital art world is there are fewer mediators. So I think, as it were, emotion comes from different angles. The other thing, I think you're absolutely right. There's a really nice writer and sort of conceptual artist called Mitchell Chan who said that the NFT separates an artwork's expressive form or artistic form, the thing you display, the media, from its commodity form. And so you can see this move taking place away from art as an object to be displayed to an art to be an asset to be transacted. And I think during 2021 there was a stat which said that the average time people held an NFT for was 30 days. That doesn't sound like the history of the ownership of art. So something fundamental has shifted, but I would like to think that this kind of it's not just a sort of faceless neoliberal kind of planet we're living on.
And I guess the only thing I would add as well is, and if it makes you feel better, it makes me feel old too, is how we're talking about art there in terms of something that we're trying to replicate the experience we have of art in this room today with a digital experience. What we're seeing is, and this is where we go back to the conversation about how the overlap with the metaverse comes into play, is that we are seeing a generation that exists digitally as well as existing physically. So I think as we see that progress and people who grow up with that sort of experience of, maybe we'll go for a coffee where we're not even in the same physical space, but you can come to our office and you can see what I've got in my office, and then I would care about what I would be able to display in that augmented or virtual reality realm.
Excellent. I think we will, obviously, our panelists might be hanging around a little bit, so if there is any questions, then, obviously, we can do that outside this forum. Again, we'd like to thank our panelists for their insights, for their feedback, for their overview of the market, and for you coming here today. And now, Nina,
Just to close, we're sort of running out of time. I feel like we could do with a few more days, actually, just to get through all of that. But thank you so much for unpacking all of those incredibly layered thoughts into an hour. I think we've all learnt something today. If you want to dive deeper and you're on the journey like we've been, please do download the report. There's a QR code on the leaflet in front of you. But otherwise, we're invited now to go and view the evening sale, the 20th and 21st century sale, and Claudia will be upstairs to answer any questions. So thank you all, and thank you to our panelists.
Thanks, Andy.
Well done.
Oh, Margaret, that was a lot of